Rain hammered against the windshield as Nathan Cole gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. The weather was unforgiving tonight, the kind of storm that seemed to drown out the world with its relentless downpour. He hated driving in the rain, but there was no avoiding it. His business meeting had dragged on longer than expected, and now he was navigating the slick streets back to his mansion on the outskirts of New York City. The radio crackled with a weather advisory, warning of severe conditions. Nathan turned it off with a frustrated sigh. The truth was, the rain didn't bother him as much as the silence did. His life, for all its wealth and success, was filled with a quiet emptiness that even the roar of a storm couldn't drown out. As he approached a dimly lit intersection, his headlights illuminated a figure on the sidewalk. A woman was pushing a stroller through the downpour, a baby in her arms and another bundled up in the cart. She moved with frantic determination, her clothes soaked, her hair plastered to her face. Nathan's foot hovered over the brake, a flicker of unease tightening his chest. For a moment, he considered driving on. He wasn't the type to stop for strangers, let alone in the middle of a storm. But something about the woman, her desperation, her sheer vulnerability, made it impossible to look away. Before he realized it, he'd pulled over to the curb. He rolled down the passenger side window, rain immediately pelting the interior of his car. "Hey," he called out, his voice louder than he intended. "Do you need help?" The woman froze, clutching the baby in her arms a little tighter. Her eyes, wide and cautious, met his through the rain. She hesitated before stepping closer, her voice barely audible over the storm. I don't know. My car broke down a few miles back, and I have nowhere to go." Nathan glanced at the stroller, where the second baby stirred but remained asleep. The sight tugged at something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. He leaned over and unlocked the door. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere safe." She hesitated again, clearly weighing her options. Nathan could see the doubt in her eyes, and he didn't blame her. A strange man offering a ride on a night like this? It was enough to make anyone wary. But the storm offered no mercy, and with a reluctant nod, she stepped into the car. The interior lights revealed her more clearly. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with tired eyes and an air of exhaustion that seemed to weigh her down. She settled the baby in her arms while carefully adjusting the stroller, ensuring the other child was secure. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do." Nathan nodded curtly, pulling back onto the road. "What were you doing out here in this weather?" "I didn't have a choice," she said, her tone defensive. "I was trying to get somewhere safe before the storm hit." He could hear the edge in her voice, the way it carried not just fear but pride. She didn't want to seem weak, even in a moment like this. Nathan respected that, though he didn't press her for details. The car fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the sound of rain pounding against the roof. "Do you have a destination in mind?" he asked finally, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. She shook her head, her wet hair falling across her face. "No. Not really. I was just trying to get away." Nathan didn't ask what she was running from. He could tell she wasn't ready to answer that, and frankly, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Instead, he focused on the road, navigating the winding streets as the storm raged on. His mansion came into view after another few minutes of tense silence. It loomed against the night like a fortress, its sharp edges and sleek design standing in stark contrast to the chaos outside. He pulled into the circular driveway, the motion sensor lights flickering on as they approached. "We're here," he said, cutting the engine. He turned to her, noting the apprehension on her face as she stared at the grand estate. "It's just for the night," he added, his tone softer. "You and the kids need to get dry." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze shifting to the sleeping baby in her arms. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Nathan stepped out into the rain, grabbing the stroller and helping her out of the car. The storm was relentless, soaking them both as they hurried toward the front door. Once inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them, a stark contrast to the cold and wet outside. The woman looked around, her expression a mix of awe and discomfort. Nathan couldn't blame her, his home was more a display of wealth than an actual place of comfort. He gestured toward the living room, where a fire crackled invitingly. "You can stay here for now. I'll find some towels." She nodded again, settling the stroller near the couch before sitting down carefully, cradling the baby close. Nathan disappeared down the hall, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know who this woman was or what had brought her into his life, but one thing was clear: she'd already disrupted the careful balance he'd built around himself. And he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. The warmth of the fire filled the spacious living room, casting a soft, flickering glow over the modern furniture. Rachel sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting around the room. She held Jack, the younger of her twins, while Mia remained bundled in the stroller beside her. Her soaked clothes clung to her, and her hair dripped onto the pristine hardwood floor. Nathan reappeared moments later, carrying a stack of towels. "Here," he said, handing her a few. He placed the rest on the coffee table and retreated slightly, as if unsure how close he should get. His movements were stiff, awkward, a man clearly unaccustomed to sharing his space. "Thank you," Rachel said softly, her voice tinged with hesitation. She quickly wrapped one towel around Jack, then began drying her own hair. Nathan couldn't help but notice how small and vulnerable she looked, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. "Can I get you something warm to drink?" he asked, breaking the silence. Rachel blinked, clearly caught off guard by the offer. "Tea, if that's okay." Nathan nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. As he moved around, boiling water and pulling down a cup, his mind raced. He couldn't remember the last time someone else had been in his home, let alone someone so utterly out of place in his world. The sight of her clutching the baby, her entire body radiating exhaustion, stayed with him, tugging at a part of him he thought had gone dormant long ago. When he returned, Rachel was wrapping a towel around Mia, murmuring soft reassurances to the sleeping baby. Nathan set the tea on the coffee table and sat in the armchair across from her, leaving a careful distance between them. Rachel glanced at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and guardedness. "I'm sorry for all of this," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to impose." "You're not imposing," Nathan replied quickly, surprising even himself. "I couldn't just leave you out there in that storm." She nodded, but her posture remained tense. "It's not every day that someone stops to help a stranger." Nathan didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting to the fire. "No," he said eventually. "It's not." The silence stretched again, heavy and awkward. Nathan felt the urge to fill it but wasn't sure how. Finally, Rachel spoke. "My car broke down a few miles from here," she explained. "I was trying to get to a motel before the weather got worse, but," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Things didn't go as planned." Nathan leaned forward slightly. "Do you have anyone you can call? Friends? Family?" Rachel hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "It's just me and the kids." Her words hung in the air, and Nathan could see the weight of them in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about tonight, she was talking about her entire life. He recognized that kind of loneliness, that kind of isolation. It mirrored his own in a way that unsettled him. "Then stay here," he said, the words out before he could stop them. Rachel looked at him, startled. "I couldn't. You've already done so much." "It's just for the night," he added quickly, trying to make it sound less significant. "Until the storm passes." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you." Nathan nodded back, leaning back in his chair. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence once again. Jack stirred in Rachel's arms, letting out a soft whimper, and she gently rocked him back to sleep. The tenderness in her movement struck Nathan, though he didn't understand why. "You seem used to this," he said after a moment, gesturing toward the babies. "Handling two at once, I mean." Rachel managed a faint smile. "You get used to it." "It's exhausting," But, they're everything to me." Her words were simple, but the emotion behind them was palpable. Nathan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, envy, maybe, or regret. He'd spent so much of his life building walls around himself that he'd forgotten what it was like to care for someone that deeply. "Do you have kids?" Rachel asked suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. "No," he said finally. "I don't." Rachel nodded, as if she'd expected that. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." Nathan didn't respond. He wasn't sure he believed her, but he didn't want to say so. Instead, he stood abruptly. "I'll get the guest room ready. You can put the kids down there." Rachel blinked, startled by his sudden movement, but nodded. "Okay. Thank you." As Nathan walked down the hall, he couldn't shake the feeling that this woman and her children were more than just a temporary disruption. They'd stirred something in him, something he'd buried a long time ago. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it left him unsettled. He pushed open the door to the guest room, flipping on the light. The room was clean and spacious, but impersonal, a reflection of his own life, he realized with a bitter twist of irony. As he set out fresh blankets, he couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. When he returned to the living room, Rachel had both babies in her arms, ready to follow him. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he noticed a glimmer of something in her eyes, hope, maybe, or trust. It was faint, but it was there. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than before. "I'll show you the room." As they walked down the hall together, the storm outside seemed a little less menacing. But Nathan knew better than to think the worst was over. For Rachel, and for himself, this was only the beginning. The sound of rain against the windows was softer now, a rhythmic patter that filled the otherwise quiet house. Rachel stood in the guest room, gently laying Jack into the crib Nathan had found tucked away in storage. Mia was already asleep on the bed, bundled securely in blankets. She brushed a damp strand of hair from her face and sighed, her body heavy with exhaustion. The room was simple but comfortable, far nicer than anywhere she had slept in months. Yet, despite the warmth and the temporary safety, her nerves were frayed. She glanced toward the door, half expecting Nathan to walk in and demand that she leave. Instead, all she heard was the faint crackle of the fire down the hall. Taking a deep breath, she sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. She had no idea who this man was or why he'd stopped to help her, but she wasn't sure she had the strength to refuse his kindness. Not tonight. Not after everything. Nathan sat in his study, a tumbler of whiskey untouched on the desk in front of him. He stared at the liquid, the amber color catching the dim light of the lamp. His mind was restless, filled with questions he wasn't ready to ask. Who was this woman? What was she running from? And why, of all people, had she ended up on his path? He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, but the memories crept in anyway. It had been years since Adam's death, but the guilt still clung to Nathan like a second skin. Adam had been more than a business partner, he'd been his best friend, the only person who had ever understood him. Losing him had been a wound Nathan couldn't heal, no matter how much money he made or how many walls he built around himself. He still remembered the phone call, the crackling static of the line as the words tore through him. Adam was gone, and it was Nathan's fault. He'd insisted on the deal that required Adam to travel that night, despite the storm. He'd pushed too hard, cared too much about the bottom line, and it had cost his friend everything. Nathan opened his eyes, the weight of the memory pressing against his chest. He reached for the glass but set it back down without drinking. Tonight wasn't the night for drowning himself in regrets. Instead, he found himself walking back to the living room, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. He sat down heavily in the armchair, his gaze fixed on the flames. He wasn't sure how long he sat there before he heard soft footsteps behind him. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her expression tentative. She'd changed into dry clothes he'd left for her, an oversized sweatshirt and sweatpants that swallowed her small frame. Her hair was damp but brushed back, and she looked more at ease than when she'd arrived, though the tension hadn't left her entirely. "I didn't mean to bother you," she said softly. "I just couldn't sleep." Nathan gestured toward the couch. "You're not bothering me. Have a seat." She hesitated before sitting down, her hands folded in her lap. For a moment, they sat in silence, the firelight dancing between them. "Are the kids okay?" Nathan asked, breaking the quiet. Rachel nodded. "They're fine. Exhausted, but fine. Thank you for letting us stay." Nathan shrugged, his tone neutral. "You didn't have many options." She glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. "You didn't have to stop." He didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure how to explain what had compelled him to pull over. Maybe it was the sight of her struggling in the rain, or the way the stroller had looked so impossibly small against the storm. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something he wasn't ready to face. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked instead, his voice quieter than before. "What brought you here?" Rachel stiffened slightly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Not really." Nathan nodded, respecting her reluctance. He understood what it was like to hold things inside, to carry the weight of something too painful to share. But her silence only deepened the questions swirling in his mind. "You don't trust me," he said, more as an observation than a question. Rachel looked up at him, startled. "It's not that," she said quickly. I've learned not to trust people so easily." Her words stung more than he expected. He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough." The silence returned, heavier this time. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting in the hem of the sweatshirt. "Why did you stop?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan blinked, caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth to answer but realized he didn't know how. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I just couldn't leave you out there." Rachel studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his sincerity. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Well, thank you. For everything." Nathan nodded, but her gratitude only made him feel more unsettled. He wasn't used to people thanking him, or relying on him, for that matter. He'd spent years keeping everyone at arm's length, and now, in a single night, this woman and her children had slipped past his defenses. As Rachel rose to her feet, murmuring a quiet goodnight, Nathan stayed where he was, staring into the fire. He could feel the cracks forming in the walls he'd built around himself, and it terrified him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The morning arrived with a pale, gray light filtering through the mansion's large windows. The storm had quieted to a steady drizzle, and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass created a calming backdrop. Nathan stood in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, staring out at the drenched garden. He couldn't shake the image of Rachel from the night before, the guarded way she'd spoken, the weight of her exhaustion. For reasons he couldn't explain, she lingered in his thoughts, pulling at a thread he didn't want unraveled. Yet here he was, wondering if she had slept, if the children were still warm and safe. As if summoned by his thoughts, Rachel appeared in the doorway, carrying Jack in one arm and holding Mia's tiny hand with the other. The babies were still in the clothes he'd left for them, soft, clean, and several sizes too big, but Rachel looked slightly more at ease. Her hair was dry now, pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her eyes held a touch less of the weariness he'd seen the night before. "Good morning," Nathan said, his voice gruff. He hadn't expected to feel awkward in his own kitchen, yet here he was. "Morning," Rachel replied, her voice soft. She hesitated, then added, "I wasn't sure where to go, but Mia was hungry." Nathan nodded toward the counter. "Help yourself. There's cereal, bread, eggs, whatever you need." Rachel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the sleek cabinets and high-end appliances that looked more like they belonged in a magazine than a working kitchen. "Thanks," she said, setting Jack down in a chair and guiding Mia to sit beside him. Nathan sipped his coffee as he watched her move around the kitchen, opening drawers and cupboards cautiously. She was quiet, her focus entirely on preparing a simple breakfast for the twins. Her movements were efficient, practiced. Clearly, she was used to managing under pressure. "Do you do this often?" Nathan asked, breaking the silence. Rachel glanced at him, puzzled. "Do what?" "Handle everything on your own." Her eyes flickered with something, pride, maybe, or defiance. "I don't have a choice," she said simply. Nathan nodded, the honesty in her voice hitting him harder than he expected. He didn't press further, sensing she wasn't ready to share more. As the babies began eating, Nathan leaned against the counter, watching the scene unfold. It was oddly domestic, Rachel cutting Mia's toast into small bites, Jack babbling happily in between bites of cereal. For a moment, Nathan almost forgot the tension that had hung over the house the night before. "They seem happy," he said quietly. Rachel looked up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "They are. They don't understand everything that's happening, and that's probably a blessing." Nathan frowned. "What is happening, exactly?" he asked, his voice cautious. "You said you're trying to get away." "From what?" Rachel's smile disappeared, replaced by the guarded look he'd seen the night before. She turned her attention back to Mia, brushing crumbs off the toddler's shirt. "It's complicated." Nathan set his coffee down, crossing his arms. "Complicated how?" Rachel's movements stilled, her hands resting on the table. For a moment, it looked like she might answer, but then she shook her head. "You wouldn't understand." The words stung more than Nathan cared to admit. "Try me." Rachel's jaw tightened, and she stood abruptly, gathering the empty plates from the table. "You've already done enough," she said, her voice clipped. "You don't need to get involved." Nathan's eyes narrowed, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "I am involved," he said firmly. "You're here, in my house, with your kids. Whatever you're running from, it's already on my doorstep." Rachel turned to face him, her expression torn between gratitude and anger. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't ask for your help, or your pity." Nathan took a step closer, his tone softening. "I'm not offering pity, Rachel. But you can't expect me to just stand by and do nothing." Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. She looked down, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I've been through enough," she whispered. "I can't risk trusting someone who might make it worse." The words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. He knew what it was like to lose trust, to build walls so high that no one could get in. He'd lived that way for years. But hearing it from her, seeing the pain in her eyes, made him realize how isolating it truly was. "I'm not trying to make it worse," he said quietly. "I just want to help." Rachel looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. Then Jack let out a loud giggle, breaking the tension. Rachel glanced at the baby, a faint smile returning to her face. "I should get them ready. We shouldn't stay here longer than we need to." Nathan's chest tightened at her words, though he wasn't sure why. "The storm hasn't completely cleared," he said, his tone almost pleading. "You should wait until it's safe." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe just for a little while longer." As she left the kitchen, the twins toddling after her, Nathan sank back into his chair, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know who Rachel was or what she was running from, but one thing was clear, she was forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd long buried. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what those parts might reveal. Nathan sat in his study as the drizzle outside blurred the world beyond the windows. His hands were folded, elbows resting on the desk as he stared at an open journal, pages empty except for a few stray notes he had written years ago. The house was unusually quiet now that Rachel and the twins had retreated to the guest room. But the quiet did nothing to calm his thoughts. If anything, it amplified the questions. Why was she so guarded? What could have pushed someone like Rachel, a woman clearly strong and capable, into such vulnerability? And why couldn't he ignore the nagging feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason? Rachel stood in the guest room, her hands shaking as she folded one of Mia's shirts. Jack sat on the bed, babbling happily, oblivious to the tension radiating from his mother. She glanced toward the door, making sure it was firmly closed. Even in this moment of refuge, she felt exposed, as if the weight of her past could crash through at any second. She had been careful for so long, building walls around her and the twins to keep them safe. But now those walls felt fragile, cracked by the storm and the man who had taken them in. Nathan had been kind, yes, but kindness always came with a cost. And Rachel wasn't sure she had anything left to pay. She picked up Jack and sat beside Mia, who was drawing on a notepad Nathan had given her earlier. Rachel ran a hand through Jack's fine hair, her eyes distant. Memories clawed their way to the surface, no matter how much she tried to suppress them. Adam, she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. The name felt like a weight in her chest, a reminder of everything she had lost. Nathan found himself standing outside the guest room door before he even realized he'd left his study. He raised a hand to knock but hesitated. What would he even say? He wasn't sure why he cared so much about Rachel and her twins, but something about her felt familiar. Or maybe it was the way her pain mirrored his own. Before he could turn away, the door creaked open. Rachel stood there, Jack balanced on her hip, her expression guarded. "Did you need something?" she asked, her tone neutral. Nathan cleared his throat, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I just wanted to check if you and the kids needed anything." Rachel studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in," she said quietly. Nathan stepped into the room, his eyes sweeping over the neatly folded clothes and the makeshift play area Rachel had set up for the twins. Mia looked up from her drawing and gave him a shy smile, which Nathan awkwardly returned. "You've done a lot for us," Rachel said after a pause, shifting Jack onto the bed. "More than anyone else has in a long time." Nathan shrugged. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Rachel countered, her voice firm. "You didn't have to stop. You didn't have to let us in. But you did." Nathan looked at her, something flickering in his eyes. "Why were you out there, Rachel? What are you running from?" Rachel froze, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. For a moment, Nathan thought she might shut him out again. But then she let out a shaky breath and sat down on the edge of the bed. "It's not just about me," she said finally, her voice quiet. "It's about Adam." The name hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened, and his pulse quickened. "Adam," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. He was the father of my kids. We were together for years. He promised me everything, and for a while, it felt like he gave me everything. But then, he was gone." Nathan's throat went dry. He could barely speak. "Adam, was your Adam Carter?" Rachel's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "How do you know that name?" Nathan took a step back, the memories crashing over him like a tidal wave. "I knew him," he said, his voice trembling. "He was my best friend." Rachel's expression twisted, her shock mingling with confusion and something deeper, anger. "You knew Adam?" she demanded. "How? Why didn't he ever tell me about you?" Nathan shook his head, struggling to piece his thoughts together. "We worked together. He was more than just a partner, he was like family. But after he died, I couldn't face anyone. I cut ties with everyone connected to him. Including you, apparently." Rachel's hands balled into fists. "You cut ties? Do you know what I went through? What we went through? I had no one. His family turned their backs on me because they blamed me for his death. And now you're telling me you were there all along?" Nathan's heart sank as the full weight of her words hit him. He had failed her, failed Adam, failed his memory, failed the family Adam had left behind. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "I didn't know about you or the kids. If I had." "But you didn't," Rachel interrupted, her voice sharp. "You didn't know because you walked away." Nathan's jaw tightened, shame flooding his veins. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I did walk away. And I've regretted it every day since." Rachel looked at him, her expression softening just slightly. For the first time, she saw the cracks in Nathan's carefully constructed exterior, the pain he had buried beneath years of silence. And for a brief moment, her anger gave way to something else, understanding. "I don't know what you think you can do now," she said finally. "But I've spent years fighting to survive. For me. For my kids. I don't need anyone coming back and trying to fix what's already broken." Nathan swallowed hard, his gaze locked on hers. "Maybe you don't need me," he said quietly. "But I need to try." The silence in the room was almost deafening, the weight of their shared pain lingering in the air. Rachel stood by the bed, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. She didn't look at Nathan as he stood there, his shoulders slumped under the crushing realization of how much he had failed, not just Adam, but Rachel and her children too. Nathan finally broke the silence. "I can't undo the past, Rachel. But I want to help now, if you'll let me." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the sincerity in his voice. But the scars she carried weren't just physical, they were deeply etched into her heart, reminders of promises broken and safety shattered. "I've heard those words before," she said softly, her voice brittle. "People say they'll help, that they'll stay. But they don't. They leave when it gets hard." Nathan flinched, the words cutting deeper than he'd expected. "I'm not them." Rachel turned to face him, her gaze sharp. "How do I know that? You didn't even know we existed. You walked away from Adam's memory, from everyone connected to him. What makes you think you can come back now and make things right?" Nathan took a deep breath, the vulnerability in her voice striking a chord within him. "Because I'm trying," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I didn't know about you and the kids, Rachel. But now that I do, I can't just walk away again." Rachel's jaw tightened, her defenses rising. "Why now? Why do you care all of a sudden?" Nathan opened his mouth to respond but realized he didn't have an easy answer. Why did he care? Why had Rachel and her children pierced through the walls he had spent years building around himself? It wasn't just guilt, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper, something he couldn't yet define. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I think Adam would have wanted it." Rachel's expression softened slightly at the mention of Adam, but the tension didn't leave her entirely. Adam always believed in people. He always thought the best of them, even when they didn't deserve it. Nathan nodded, his throat tightening. "I know. And he believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it. That's why I'm trying now, Rachel. I owe it to him. And I owe it to you." Rachel sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the conversation. She looked down at Jack, who had fallen asleep on the bed, his tiny hands curled into fists. Mia sat nearby, still absorbed in her drawings, blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. "Trust isn't something I can give easily," Rachel said finally, her voice quiet. "Not anymore." "I don't expect you to trust me right away," Nathan said, taking a cautious step closer. "But let me prove it to you. Let me help, even if it's just to make sure you and the kids are safe." Rachel hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. She didn't want to rely on anyone, least of all a man who reminded her so much of Adam. But she was tired. Tired of running, of fighting alone, of carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained wary. "Okay. But don't make promises you can't keep." Nathan nodded, relief washing over him. "I won't." That night, after the children were asleep and Rachel had retreated to the guest room, Nathan found himself wandering through his house. The mansion felt too big, too empty, the silence pressing in on him like a physical weight. For years, he had filled the space with distractions, work, expensive art, endless renovations, but none of it had ever made the place feel like home. He found himself back in his study, staring at the photo on his desk. It was one of the few he'd kept after Adam's death, a picture of the two of them standing in front of their first office, grinning like they had the whole world ahead of them. Nathan's hand hovered over the frame, his chest tightening as the memories rushed back. "I should have been there for you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have done more." The guilt was a familiar companion, but tonight it felt heavier, more urgent. Rachel's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he realized just how much he had failed not only Adam but himself. He had spent years running from the pain, burying himself in work and solitude, but now the past was staring him in the face, demanding to be reckoned with. In the guest room, Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The day's revelations had left her shaken, and sleep felt impossible. She glanced over at Jack and Mia, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She thought about Nathan, about the guilt in his eyes and the quiet determination in his voice. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let him shoulder some of the burden she had carried for so long. But the other part of her, the part that had been betrayed and abandoned too many times, screamed for her to keep her guard up. "People leave," she whispered to herself, the words bitter. "They always do." But as she closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The morning sunlight pierced through the gray clouds, scattering across the wet pavement outside. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a stillness that felt both calming and unnerving. Nathan stepped out onto the back patio, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The cool air bit at his skin, but he didn't mind. His thoughts were heavier than the chill in the wind. He had barely slept, his mind racing with the memories Rachel's words had unearthed. Adam's name still echoed in his head, stirring feelings he had buried long ago. For years, Nathan had convinced himself that shutting out the past was the only way to survive. But now, the past had found him, forcing him to confront everything he had tried to forget. He turned his gaze to the horizon, the city skyline barely visible in the distance. "What would you do, Adam?" he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet ache. He didn't expect an answer, but the weight in his chest didn't lessen. Inside the house, Rachel stood at the edge of the guest room, watching Mia play on the carpet while Jack napped on the bed. She rubbed her temples, the tension in her body refusing to ease. Nathan's words from the night before replayed in her mind, his quiet insistence that he wanted to help, that he owed it to Adam. She didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't the cold, distant man she had assumed at first. Beneath the reserved exterior, there was a pain that mirrored her own, a guilt she couldn't fully understand but somehow recognized. And yet, trusting him felt like stepping off a ledge, not knowing if there was anything to catch her. Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Nathan stood there, his expression hesitant but determined. "I need to go out," he said. "I'll be back in a few hours, but if you need anything, let me know." Rachel frowned. "Where are you going?" Nathan hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "There's something I need to do. Something I should have done a long time ago." Rachel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay. Be careful." Nathan gave her a small, grateful smile before turning and walking away. The car ride was silent except for the hum of the engine. Nathan gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove toward the outskirts of the city, his chest tightening with every mile. He knew where he was going, though he hadn't been there in years. The thought of returning filled him with dread, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. It didn't take long to reach the cemetery. The iron gates loomed ahead, their blackened surface streaked with rust. Nathan parked the car just outside and stepped out, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat as he made his way inside. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes, the sound eerily loud in the quiet. He found Adam's grave near the edge of the cemetery, beneath a sprawling oak tree. The headstone was simple, engraved with Adam's name and the dates of his birth and death. Nathan stared at it for a long moment, his throat tightening. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I should have been here sooner." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He sank to his knees, the damp grass soaking through his pants, and let the silence wrap around him. "You were my best friend," he continued, his voice trembling. "And I failed you. I let you carry the weight of everything because I thought you could handle it. I thought you were invincible. But you weren't. Nathan's shoulders sagged as the guilt he had carried for so long poured out of him. I blamed myself for so long, he admitted. For pushing you, for not being there. And when you were gone, I didn't know how to face it. So I didn't. I walked away from everything. From everyone. He paused, his hands curling into fists at his sides. And then I found Rachel. She and the kids, they're your family, Adam. And I didn't even know they existed. How could I have missed that? How could I have let her go through this alone? The wind rustled the leaves above him, the only response to his words. Nathan closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. I can't fix what I've done. But I can try to be better. For her. For them. For you. Nathan stayed there for a while, the weight in his chest slowly giving way to something else, resolve. He had spent years running from his pain, but now, for the first time, he felt ready to face it. When he finally stood, the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the cemetery. Nathan took one last look at Adam's grave, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. I'll take care of them, he said quietly. I promise. Back at the mansion, Rachel stood by the window, watching the drizzle return as the day wore on. Her mind drifted to Nathan, wondering where he had gone and what demons he was confronting. Mia tugged at her pant leg, holding up a drawing. Mommy, look, she said excitedly. Rachel knelt down, taking the paper in her hands. It was a crude drawing of a house, with 3 small figures standing in front of it. That's you and me and Jack, Mia explained proudly. And that's Mr. Nathan. Rachel's chest tightened at the mention of Nathan. She didn't know what role he would play in their lives, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as she had thought. The air was still heavy when Nathan returned to the mansion later that afternoon. He parked his car in the circular driveway, the hum of the engine fading into silence. The visit to Adam's grave had left him emotionally drained, but also determined. It was time to stop running, from the past, from his guilt, and now, from the responsibility he felt toward Rachel and her children. As he entered the house, the faint sounds of laughter greeted him. Nathan followed the noise to the living room, where Mia and Jack were playing on the carpet with a set of blocks he hadn't realized he still owned. Rachel sat nearby, her posture more relaxed than he'd seen before. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting from curiosity to guardedness. Did you handle what you needed to? She asked cautiously. Nathan nodded, setting his coat on the back of a chair. Yeah, he replied. I did. Rachel watched him for a moment, as if searching for something in his face. Then she turned her attention back to the twins, though Nathan could tell her mind was still elsewhere. That night, as the twins slept in the guest room, Rachel and Nathan sat across from each other in the living room, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. I need to tell you something, Rachel said finally, breaking the stillness. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in her hands as she twisted them together. Nathan set his glass of water on the table, leaning forward slightly. What is it? Rachel hesitated, her gaze flickering to the flames. It's about why I was out there that night. Why I've been running. Nathan remained quiet, giving her the space to speak. After Adam died, she began, her voice trembling, his family turned on me. They blamed me for his death, said I'd been a distraction, that I'd made him reckless. I thought they'd leave me alone after a while, but, she swallowed hard. But they didn't. Nathan's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. What do you mean? They've been trying to take the kids from me, Rachel said, her voice cracking. They said I'm not fit to raise them. They think they have a right to them because they're Adam's blood, but they don't care about them. They just want control. Nathan felt his hands curl into fists at her words. How long has this been going on? Since the day Jack and Mia were born, Rachel admitted. At first, it was just lawyers and threats. Then it was constant pressure, following me, showing up at my home, trying to intimidate me. That night, when you found me, her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath. They'd found out where I was staying. I didn't know what else to do. I just grabbed the kids and ran. Nathan's chest tightened, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He could see the fear in Rachel's eyes, the desperation that had driven her to keep moving, to keep fighting. And yet, she had done it all alone. You don't have to keep running, Nathan said, his voice firm. Not anymore. Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. What are you saying? I'm saying I can help, Nathan said. I have the resources, the connections. If they're trying to take the kids from you, we'll stop them. I'll make sure they can't hurt you anymore. Rachel shook her head, her voice trembling. Nathan, you don't understand. They're powerful. They have money, influence. And so do I, Nathan interrupted, his tone resolute. More than they do, if we use it the right way. Rachel stared at him, her emotions flickering across her face, fear, hope, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. Why would you do this for us? Nathan hesitated, then leaned forward, his gaze steady. Because I should have done it years ago. For Adam. For you. And because I won't stand by and let them destroy what he loved. Rachel's breath caught at his words. For the first time in years, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift, just slightly. The next morning, Nathan was on the phone with his attorney, his voice sharp and commanding. Rachel watched from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly as she listened to the fragments of the conversation. Words like cease and desist and legal action floated toward her, each one sending a ripple of both relief and anxiety through her. When Nathan hung up, he turned to her, his expression calm but determined. They'll back off, he said. And if they don't, we'll hit them with everything we have. Rachel exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Nathan replied. This is what Adam would have wanted. Rachel nodded, her throat tight. She didn't trust easily, but Nathan's actions spoke louder than his words. For the first time, she felt like she might have found someone who wasn't just passing through her life, someone who might actually stay. Later that day, as the drizzle turned into sunshine, Nathan found himself in the backyard with Jack and Mia. He watched as the twins toddled across the grass, their laughter filling the air. Rachel sat on the porch, her gaze fixed on the scene before her. You're good with them, she said softly. Nathan looked over his shoulder, a small smile tugging at his lips. I'm figuring it out. Rachel's lips curved into a faint smile. They like you. Nathan glanced back at the twins, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar warmth. I like them too. Rachel's smile faltered slightly, her eyes growing distant. I've spent so long trying to protect them, trying to be everything for them. It's hard to let someone else in. Nathan walked over to her, his gaze steady. You don't have to do it alone anymore, Rachel. Not if you don't want to. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt herself believe those words. And for the first time, she felt like she might not have to keep running. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the mansion, casting warm light over the hardwood floors. The storm had completely passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear day. Inside, the house was filled with the sounds of life, Jack's giggles, Mia's chatter, and the occasional clatter of toys. Nathan stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands. He watched Rachel from a distance as she sat on the floor with the twins, helping Mia stack blocks into a precarious tower. Rachel's laughter rang out when the tower collapsed, and Nathan couldn't help but smile at the sound. The scene before him felt surreal, like a snapshot of a life he had never imagined for himself. For years, Nathan's world had been defined by isolation and control, but now, his home felt different, alive, even. Earth to Nathan, Rachel's voice called out, pulling him from his thoughts. She was standing in the doorway, Mia perched on her hip while Jack toddled toward her. Sorry, Nathan said, straightening. What's up? I was just wondering if you had plans for the day, Rachel said, her tone casual. I thought I might take the kids outside for a bit. It's too nice to stay cooped up. Nathan hesitated for a moment, then set his coffee down. I'll come with you, he said. Rachel blinked, clearly surprised, but she nodded. Okay. Outside, the garden was still damp from the rain, but the grass glistened in the sunlight. Mia squealed with delight as she chased Jack across the lawn, her tiny legs pumping furiously. Nathan and Rachel sat on the porch steps, their eyes on the children as they ran in circles. They're happy, Nathan said quietly. They are, Rachel agreed, her voice soft. For the first time in a long time, they feel safe. Nathan glanced at her, noting the way her shoulders seemed less tense than before. And you, he asked. Do you feel safe? Rachel hesitated, her gaze fixed on the twins. I don't know, she admitted. I want to. But it's hard to let my guard down. Nathan nodded, understanding. I get that. But I meant what I said. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Rachel turned to him, her expression unreadable. You've done so much for us already. I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You're not, Nathan said firmly. You and the kids, you've reminded me what it means to care about something. To care about someone. And that's not something I take lightly. Rachel's eyes softened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she looked back at the twins, who were now lying on the grass, giggling as they pointed at the clouds. The sight made her heart swell, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Later that afternoon, Nathan found himself in his study, sifting through old papers. He had spent so much of his life burying the past, but now he wanted to face it. To understand it. To honor it. Among the papers, he found an old photo of him and Adam, taken during the early days of their company. They were young, ambitious, and full of dreams. Nathan stared at the photo for a long moment before setting it aside. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Nathan, the voice asked, surprised. Hey, Paul, Nathan said, his voice steady. I need your help. Rachel sat in the living room, her legs tucked beneath her as she watched the twins play with the blocks again. The house felt quieter now that Nathan had retreated to his study, but the quiet didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful. Her mind wandered to everything that had happened in the past few days. Nathan's support had been a lifeline she hadn't expected, and though she was still weary, she couldn't deny the relief she felt. For so long, she had carried the weight of survival alone. Now, for the first time, she felt like someone else was sharing that weight. But what did that mean? And what would it mean for her and the kids if Nathan decided he didn't want to stay involved? Her thoughts were interrupted when Nathan appeared in the doorway, his expression calm but resolute. Can we talk? He asked. Rachel nodded, motioning for him to sit beside her. He hesitated for a moment before settling onto the couch, his hands resting on his knees. I made some calls, Nathan began. To people I trust. Lawyers, private investigators, people who can help. We're going to make sure Adam's family doesn't have a case against you. Rachel's eyes widened. You did that for us? Nathan nodded. Of course. You and the kids deserve to feel safe, Rachel. And I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. Rachel swallowed hard, her chest tightening. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Nathan said gently. This isn't just about you. It's about Adam, and about what he would have wanted. He loved you, Rachel. And I know he'd want you and the kids to be happy. Rachel felt tears prick her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Nathan smiled, a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. We'll get through this, he said. Together. Rachel nodded, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Nathan's calls to his network had set things in motion faster than Rachel could have imagined. Lawyers handled the legal threats from Adam's family with ruthless efficiency, ensuring they had no claim to the children. Investigators uncovered every angle of Rachel's case, reinforcing her rights as the sole guardian of Jack and Mia. Slowly but surely, the storm that had loomed over her life for years began to clear. Nathan had been at the center of it all. He was relentless in his efforts, attending every meeting, making sure every detail was handled. His presence became a constant, not just in the legal battles but in Rachel's everyday life. He was there for dinners, playtime with the twins, and even the quiet moments when Rachel struggled to process the weight she had carried for so long. One sunny morning, Rachel stood in the backyard, watching as Nathan chased Jack and Mia across the lawn. The twins' laughter echoed through the crisp air, their joy infectious. Nathan was grinning, his sharp features softened as he playfully scooped Jack into his arms while Mia clung to his leg. Rachel couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was a scene she never thought she'd witness, a life she never thought she'd have. For years, she had been so consumed with survival that she hadn't allowed herself to dream of more. But now, standing in the warm sunlight with her children safe and happy, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. As Nathan set Jack down and turned to catch Mia, his eyes met Rachel's. He gave her a small, lopsided smile, and Rachel felt a warmth spread through her chest. She nodded at him, her smile widening, and in that moment, she realized just how much he had come to mean to her. That evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Nathan and Rachel sat on the porch, the stars twinkling above them. A soft breeze carried the scent of rain from the storm that had passed days before. "You know," Rachel began, her voice quiet, "for the longest time, I thought I had to do it all alone. That I couldn't rely on anyone." Nathan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that feeling," he said. "I lived with it for years." Rachel turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What changed?" Nathan hesitated, staring out at the darkened garden. "You did," he admitted. "You and the kids. Meeting you forced me to face things I've been running from my whole life. Losing Adam, it broke me in ways I didn't even realize. But helping you, helping them, it made me feel like I was doing something that mattered. Like I could make up for all the mistakes I made." Rachel's chest tightened at his words, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "You didn't have to do any of this, Nathan. You didn't owe us anything." Nathan turned to her, his gaze steady. "Maybe not. But I wanted to. Because I care about you, Rachel. About the kids. More than I ever thought I could." Rachel's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. For so long, she had guarded herself against the possibility of relying on someone else, of letting someone in. But Nathan wasn't just anyone. He had proven himself in ways no one else ever had. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she whispered. Nathan reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to know," he said softly. "Because you're not alone anymore." Rachel looked at him, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. For the first time, she let herself believe that she and her children could have more than just survival, they could have a life. A real, happy life. The next morning, the family ventured out to a park nearby. The sun was bright, the sky painted with a vibrant rainbow from a light drizzle that had fallen earlier. Jack and Mia ran ahead, their laughter ringing out as they chased each other through the grass. Nathan and Rachel walked side by side, watching the twins with matching smiles. The tension that had once hung between them was gone, replaced by an easy companionship that felt natural and right. As they reached a bench, Nathan stopped, his gaze fixed on the twins. "You know," he said, his voice contemplative, "for a long time, I thought I didn't deserve this. A chance to be happy." Rachel turned to him, her brow furrowing. "Why not?" Nathan shrugged, his expression pensive. "I let my guilt control me for so long. I thought if I kept punishing myself, it would make up for everything I'd done wrong. But now, I realize that maybe the best way to honor Adam isn't to carry that guilt forever. It's to live. To make sure the people he cared about are okay." Rachel reached out, resting her hand on his arm. "You've done more for us than I ever could have asked, Nathan. You don't have to carry that guilt anymore." Nathan looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks to you, I'm starting to believe that." As the twins played beneath the rainbow, Rachel and Nathan sat together on the bench, the warmth of the sun on their skin. For the first time, both of them felt a sense of closure, not just for the past, but for the lives they had left behind. Together, they had found something neither of them had expected, a second chance. The rainbow arched high above them, a symbol of renewal and hope. And as Jack and Mia ran toward them, laughing and carefree, Nathan and Rachel knew that their story, one forged in loss, struggle, and redemption, was just beginning.